Welcome everybody to Taking the First Steps, Module 7. This is Nomination Finances. So just a recap as to how we got to this program. We're a team of racialized progressives with various political campaign experiences coming together to bridge gaps of knowledge so that more Canadians feel comfortable in taking a political nomination. Our end goal is to build a collection of free videos and blog material that enables more racialized citizens to consider seeking political office. And our guiding principle is that no person should be limited from accessing this material, regardless of race, income, location, or partisan ideology. This is Module 7 out of the 8-module series.
Our guest speaker today is Allen Alexandre. He's a wonderful individual, someone with a lot of experience, a community organizer, a political advisor, someone who has not only an in-depth knowledge of the political process, but is able to really give some great insights. And we're, in fact, really lucky to have him today and a part of the session. He was a federal Liberal campaign manager and field organizer. He served as a senior issues manager and advisor to cabinet members. He's currently, I believe, Director of Parliamentary Affairs for Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, and as well has served as a community organizer and mentor for Black Canadians in entrepreneurship and politics. Welcome, Allen, and really lucky to have you.
Hey, thanks a lot for the introduction, Abdi, and thank you guys for having me here today. I think this project Be Heard Canada is critical. One of the things that I've experienced in my time in politics was the constant lack of representation at various levels of politics, whether it be at the organizing level or the cabinet level and senior management level. I've been fortunate enough to have worked in all three areas and to have over the years developed a good understanding of what it requires to be successful running for office, but just to be in politics writ large. So I'm happy to be here to basically share with you some content and information as it relates to compliance. And then where this is going to be very interesting is in particular for those that decide to run for politics but don't really know what the rules are and where to step. So I'm going to guide you through that a little bit today. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what the compliance components of running for office are. I would caveat this by saying that everything that we have, information that I'll be sharing today, is all based on current legislation as it relates to compliance. But these things, because of the pandemic, and considering we might go into an election during pandemic, then these things could potentially be subject to change. So I just wanted to caveat that with that. But otherwise, as the field currently stands today, this is where we are. So the three areas we're going to be talking about today are the fundamentals of financing and compliance, election expenses, and contributions. So why don't we start with election compliance and financing? One of the things that we notice year after year, election after election, is that you will end up with candidates and even political parties sometimes that, because they sometimes lack a full understanding of what compliance in terms of financing is, that they end up sometimes on the wrong side of the law, and then they end up with fines from Election Canada, or sometimes they actually have to think about how to basically become compliant because they might have done something that just that they weren't allowed to do. So we're going to be talking about this a little bit. And the first slide here that I want to go into is talking about the Canada Elections Act. And I think for anyone running for office, it's important for you to have an understanding of the Canada Elections Act and what it does. And then the Act, as you know, it regulates the election of members of Parliament to the House of Commons. So there will be two phases for you as a candidate, potentially, running for office. The first one is naturally going through a nomination process. And the second step would be to actually run for office in case you are successful for your nomination. And what we're going to do here is talk about, what are some of the things that you want to do to begin with. So we're talking about an electoral list, nomination contest, limits on spending on election advertising by all sorts of groups, including pressure and interest groups, and anything that relates to the publication of broadcast of election advertising and material. So all these things are really, really important to get an understanding of. So we're going to start quickly with the definition of contribution. So a contribution is a monetary contribution or a non-monetary contribution. And some of the terms that are really associated with the contribution are, things like passing the hat. So what is passing the hat, for example? Passing the hat is the process whereby, in the context of, organizing an event, people decide that they wanted to, collect a certain amount of money for the purpose of financing their campaigns. The passing the hat is something that is possible for you to do if the amount of money you're getting from your participants are under $20 or $20 or under, that is. And that notion is something that we see very often. It's something that you can use if you're having like a large, gathering of people, like 100 people or whatever that might be. Then you might be able to really get out there like $10, $15, like, $9, $20, from every participant, and be able to really stack up on a little bit of money without necessarily having to worry about running afoul of the law when it comes to campaign contribution. So this is a good trick that you can actually think about. One of the things we're going to be touching on is later on, but that you need to have good knowledge of ahead of time, is the notion of commercial value. Commercial value is essentially what an object or service is worth on the marketplace at a particular time. So that means that if you were to get someone to do something for you, the commercial value of that thing would be, what is it in the context of an election that normally would have cost you had that person that volunteered to do that work for you for free. So Elections Canada sets very clear rules and boundaries as to what commercial value is. So we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. A few other notions here that are just more broadly that touch on the advertising component of the election, or blackout, for example. So what happens on election day, which is the time period when you are not allowed to advertise, but there will be some exceptions to that as well. And the most critical piece here that I think everyone needs to understand in this first slide is the notion of an official agent. So this is the most critical piece of the campaign. If you're looking at running for office, one of the first tasks that you need to put yourself to is to find yourself an official agent. Because until such time that you have an official agent, you're not able to create a bank account. If you cannot create a bank account, that means that you cannot collect money. And if you cannot collect money, that means that you cannot run either a nomination race or you cannot run an election. So the other thing that I want to talk to you about in this particular context is, taglines. So taglines are essentially advertisements that are distributed, as you see here, like, through traditional means such as signs, billboards, flyers, pamphlets, radio ads, television ads, whatever those might be, and now more and more the internet. And these are typically run during an election period. And that election period is essentially the time that the Election Canada has decided the campaign has started, and the end of that time. And within that time period, you will actually have expense limits. And those expense limits are essentially what a campaign or a candidate is allowed to spend during the election. So how's that calculated? It's very simple. Election expense limits are determined based on the particularities of a riding, and that will basically vary from place to place. So if your neighbor who ran for office last time had an expense limit of $48,000, it doesn't mean that it automatically applies to you. So part of the job that you need to do is to get an understanding of what those limits are for your particular riding. And then that oftentimes to determine that information, you'll be able to look at what was allowed the year before for that particular writing, or not the year before, I should say, what was allowed for that for the last election in that particular writing. So there will be particularities, as I mentioned, for each writing, but broadly speaking, the limits are fairly the same. If you are within an area like the Toronto GTA, for example, and it'll be very different if, for example, you're like in a more rural area. So these are things that you need to look at. And then, so they're going to be looking at the number of names appearing on the preliminary electoral list. You're going to be looking at providing an adjustment for candidates, running in those ridings where there are fewer electors than the national average. So these are some of the, some of the factors that are taken into account by Election Canada when they are determining what is the particular expense limit in a writing. But in addition to that, Election Canada will also, factor in things like such as inflation with respect to the previous election. And they would actually be looking at how large the writing is, generally speaking. So the talking about how large the writing is not as much to talk about the writing in terms of just population, the number of people that's in it, but it's also what does that mean geographically? Because it probably requires more resources to run a campaign, like in a 400 square kilometer area than it is to do it like in a 52 square kilometer area. So these are some of the factors that are looked at by Elections Canada. So one thing that we get a lot of question on oftentimes during my time in politics, and what we hear often from candidates and their teams, is what is the difference between an election expense and an electoral campaign expense? So an election expense is essentially any cost that you would incur of non-monetary nature that was essentially used to directly promote or oppose a candidate during an election period. It also involves any non-monetary transfer receipt from a registered party or registered writing association for a particular party that is used also to promote or oppose a candidate during an election. And what does that mean really in real terms? It just means that if you are in a position where any kind of sum of money was used in a way that gives you a certain advantage or was used in a way that was detrimental to the success of your opponent, or that can be considered whatever means, financial means or non-financial means that were used to achieve that end, would actually fall under the definition of an election expense. So, for example, money that you spend for property or service that is used in the campaign would be considered an expense, right? So that's just the way it works. So if you had a T-shirt printed, it might have been done before the election, but this is like elect, Allen Alexandre. Well, then if I can use that during the campaign to promote myself, or if I really develop any kind of billboards that I really put up anywhere, like in front of an office somewhere against my opponent, then that that expense itself is considered an election expense. So electoral campaign expenses are a little bit different. So they are what you call like reasonably incurred, and reasonably is obviously whenever you use that term, it means that a certain amount of latitude is left to Elections Canada to make that kind of determination. But by and large, it's going to be considered like anything that you use as an incidence of the election, regardless of when the expense was incurred. And that could be election expense, which is what I mentioned earlier. It could be the candidate's personal expenses. It could be the candidate's travel and living expenses. It could be the candidate's litigation expenses, accessibility, and other stuff that you would typically need or require during an election campaign. So again, the good way to remember this is to tell yourself an electoral campaign expense is not always an election expense, but an election expense is always an electoral campaign expense. So election expenses, what's considered an election expense? Well, traditional election advertising, election signs, whether they're installed or not, election advertising on the internet, which I mentioned at the top of our conversation, websites and web content, all of these things are really considered election expenses. So traditional election advertising, what is that exactly? So that is essentially any message, anything that you really use to promote yourself as a candidate, or that you use to basically bash the other guy. So anything that gives you an advantage and anything that really puts the sticks in the wheel of the other guy, or it can be perceived as such. These things fall under the category of what you would call like a traditional election advertising. And I mentioned earlier, like, for myself, like, printing a T-shirt, for example, with my name, in capital letters, elect me, whatever the year that might be, that would fall under that. So if it's naming me, or if it's naming the other candidate, or if it's showing a photo of me, or liking of me, or the other guy, all of these things would fall under the category of traditional election advertising. Election signs, now, whether they're installed or not, are the exact same thing. So, and then I think one thing I really wanted to emphasize here is the fact that one of the common campaign mistakes that we see, and then I think pretty much every candidate or their team at some point either experienced that as an issue or actually needed or had actually committed that mistake. And it's the idea of buying a lot of signs without and before mapping out the writing and properly serve their needs. And then what do I mean by that? It just means that if you're in a position where you're going to be buying, putting money on signs and etc., one of the things that you need to do is to understand, like, how large is my writing? What is the population? What are some of those areas where I need to be present and need to be seen? And what are some of those areas where I don't actually need it as much? So that's actually a critical piece, because it's not just about like really being smart in terms of where you're geographically positioning yourself in terms of being seen and advertised. It's about like, using your money in a very smart way. One thing that we say very often, election signs don't win elections. But if you do decide that you want to do election signs, you also want to be smart about how much money you're spending on it. And for you to be smart about it is to actually get a full understanding, a full survey of your writing, so that you know exactly what the needs are and you're not really just throwing all your money on election signs. Election advertising on the internet is also something what we're seeing more and more. I think as much as people rely on the traditional way of doing things, which is basically to get a name out, to get front lawn signs, or to be up anywhere that's actually visible. The internet, as you know, is where people now consume their news. In this age of the pandemic, for example, I would not expect any political party that is really sane and smart to be spending a considerable amount of money on putting up signs on people's like front lawns and etc. I think a good chunk of that money would naturally be going towards advertising on the internet, and then that's anything that's Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn, for example. Anywhere online now is a safe space. Is a space for people and political candidates to advertise. And within the trends over the last few years have shown that candidates will be spending even more money on online advertising than they will be doing in sort of more traditional advertising, which typically would have involved, the idea of actually having signs out there in the streets. So what would be considered an election advertising on the internet? So that would be anything that meets the general criteria for an election advertising. So we already talked about that just a couple slides ago. anything that would actually normally have a placement cost. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of people do, as you know, in marketing now is that, you'll go on Google or you go on Yahoo or whatever website you go on, and you'll see something that really comes across as being some kind of a headline. But when in fact, when you look closely, you're going to notice there's a little segment that says sponsored on it. And then that is what we're seeing more and more. So people tend to be everywhere on the internet. And then they're using that space to really, candidates are using that space themselves as well to really promote and market themselves. So what is not election advertising on the internet? That would be any messages that are sent or posted for free on Twitter, Facebook. So, I put in the names here. These are, people that I've actually worked with in the past that I thought about, like just mentioning the names because of the amazing job they've done in really developing that skill and getting things out there, but without necessarily having to pay any money without actually putting the campaigns in a situation where they have to spend a lot of money. So you can be very smart about crafting a message that normally would require paid advertising. But if you're good about targeting people, then you can use the proper hashtags and other tools that are available to really market yourself on the internet. And messages that are sent by email, for example, or by text are not considered election advertising. And videos that are posted pro bono on platforms such as YouTube and Instagram, for example, these are not considered election advertising either. So in terms of the money and the compliance, these wouldn't be things for you to worry about. You can actually use them as much as possible if you don't have a lot of money to promote yourself. However, anything that is associated, any associated expenses to that is what would actually become an expense. And then what do I mean by that? We're going to get into that in the next slides a little bit more. That means, like, if there was a cost to produce, those things, whether it's by using a professional or anyone to really develop the content that ended up being posted online, those things themselves would become election expense. But again, the difference here is that you're not paying to put it up on the web, you're not promoting it, so therefore it's not an election expense. But anyone that you use, any professional service that you use to really develop that content would qualify as an election expense. So the election advertising on the internet and blackout period, when does that typically take effect? Well, the blackout essentially applies to any internet ads that are actively, again, I say that are actively targeting different users on a regular basis, and whose transmission date is the actual campaign is able to control. So what does that mean? It means that if you had to get an ad going, whether it's paid or on the internet, and that was paid, if you have control over when that thing that data, the advertising date actually ends, well, then you would be in a position where you would need to basically stop it, meaning that it would not be able to run past a certain time, during blackout. And blackout is what we explained earlier, the time that you are not allowed to make any advertisement, and that's typically on election day. But the blackout will not apply to any messages that you place before blackouts that kicks in and remain the same during the blackout. So if you had not modified the initial content that was on the website and it was already there on blackout, they can stay on there. But on the very blackout day or that time period, you would not be allowed to modify that content or to basically create no content. So that you're not allowed to do. What also is not wouldn't apply to blackout would be sharing information about an event that, and I say GT because then again, sometimes my brain goes automatically just intruder because it's the work that I've done. But GT could actually be any leader in this particular case here. Be sharing any information about an event that the leader of a political party would actually attend. So that would not fall under it, because at that point it's not seeking to influence the outcome of the election. It's merely promoting an event that would actually be happening as a result of that election. So websites and web content. So campaign website and social media accounts, whether they existed before or they're new, that promote the candidate during an election period, would be considered money spent for the campaign website itself. So if you were to design it, host it, have it maintained on the internet, for example, these things would fall under election expense. And then, as I kind of mentioned earlier, any expenses for the production and distribution of that content on the website, regardless of when the content was posted or created, that also would be considered an election expense. So writing associations, websites, and their social media accounts that are used to promote candidates and stays online during the election period, these things too would be considered, they would be considered election expenses. And expenses for the production and distribution of content on the site or social media accounts for the purpose of the campaign, pre-existing content that is posted for the purpose of the campaign or promoted during the campaign. All these things also would fall under the category of election expenses. So what's important here to remember is that if you're transferring any monies or any funds from the writing association to the campaign, and it's actually serving to promote the candidate, that all these things, they need to be approved by the official agent, which sort of brings me back to what I said at the beginning, is that the very idea of really getting into that space without actually having an official agent that really understands what the law is and what that requires is actually really, really, really a mistake that no one should ever make. And so again, building a team requires having the right people by your side. But no one is more important, and I would say even more so than the campaign manager, than the official agent, because that official agent really looks after everything as it relates to money, compliance, and regulations. Everything goes to the official agent, from signing the checks that you're giving to your to the producer of a particular ad, to getting your T-shirt printed or your signs printed. All that money needs to go through your official agent. So again, I don't want to, I can't really overstate the importance of actually having an official agent. Should the official agent decide to not have expense count, any expense count towards the limits, and we talked about the limits at the beginning, your official agent actually has the ability to really work on that and determine whether or not that can happen. But if they were to decide that they would not actually have any expense count towards the limit, the website must go offline during the election period. So these are ways sort of to navigate through it. But then again, your official agent would be in a good position to know what the rules are and make sure you can actually do the right thing. Okay. So the websites and web content. So the candidate's personal website and social media accounts used for the purpose of the campaign, expenses for the production and distribution of content on the site or social media accounts for the purpose of the campaign as well, along with pre-existing content that were posted for the purpose of the campaign. All these things would be considered election expenses. So again, part of the part of what's considered election expense is the candidate's website and social media accounts, expenses for the production and distribution of content on the site or social media accounts for the purpose of the campaign. Any pre-existing content posted for the purpose of the campaign or promoted during the election, during the campaign, and the use of the website for campaign purposes. All these things will fall under election expense, under the election expense category. So now, one thing that is really critical, and I wanted to emphasize that, is that candidates are allowed to have websites and social media accounts that are designed and maintained using parliamentary resources. But then again, that's only if you, as a person, you would actually been elected. But outside of that exception, if you are not been elected, you are not an existing member of parliament at the time that the writ dropped or that the election started, well, then that doesn't really apply to you. So that's only for people that have already been elected. And then that's the only exception to that rule. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. So the notion of contribution, which brings us to, so we are now at the second part of our presentation, which is on the notion of contribution. So the question I've been asked all the time is like, what really is a contribution? Like, that question really eludes a lot of people because the lines and nuances can be so fine that if you don't really have, someone really taking the time to read through the content, it may be easy for them to really kind of overstep the mark a little bit, or even sometimes just completely blow it. And you don't want to be in that position. So what we want to do here is talk about, like, the notion of contribution. What is contribution exactly for the purpose of someone running for office? So a contribution is donated money, meaning that is actual monetary contribution, or donated property or services that are non-monetary contribution. So if you give me $20, or if you decide you want to give me a cell phone, if I'm using the cell phone for the purpose of the campaign, it is considered a contribution. And just like if you give me $25 and that money goes towards the campaign, that also is considered a contribution. So it's important to really understand that there is the monetary component of it and there's a non-monetary component of it that can take the form of, services or gifts or a number of other things. And then these are what we consider to be contribution. And then they need to come obviously from, a Canadian citizen or permanent resident of Canada. So as long as, they meet this criteria, these things would be considered a contribution. So monetary versus non-monetary contributions. A monetary contribution is an amount of money provided that is not repayable, meaning that the person gave the money, he didn't really give, it wasn't really a loan or like anything of that nature. It really gave it to you because I'm giving that money because I want you to win that election, and this is my way to actually support you. And if that amount is over $20, automatically in the context of an election, or for someone running for office, a candidate, that amount of money would be considered a monetary contribution. So what are some of the actions, I would say, that fall under the monetary contribution? There would be cash, would be checks, money orders, credit card or debit card payments, online payments. So these are what fall under the monetary contribution category. A non-monetary contribution is, as I hinted a little bit earlier, is the amount of the commercial value of a service, right? So if I take this cell phone here, and I said, here, Nathan, you take this for your campaign. And then you realize, oh yeah, well, great, thank you, Allen. I've been wanting to actually have a cell phone, but I'm realizing I didn't actually have enough funds to afford a cell phone for the campaign. So I really appreciate you giving that to me. So not only are you making a non-monetary contribution to Nathan's campaign, it's also the value of what you gave to Nathan that's actually critical. So if this phone is actually worth $500, and then this is what he received in the context of the campaign, well, then it counts towards $500 for the campaign. So this is why it's critical to really understand that as much as you want to receive things from people, and then you are likely to receive things from people, you also need to make sure these things are really being reported to the official agent. Because if your campaign were to be audited and they realize that in the process, like, 6 different people from somewhere came and give you, like, 5, $500 phones, well, then if you start doing the math, you quickly realize that you've actually had $3,000 that actually been deducted from your campaign limit. So it's critical to really understand that, but also more importantly, that your official agent is being made aware of those contributions at all time so they can determine the value, and making sure that when these things are being reported to Election Canada, you're not getting dinged in the process. So the commercial value here is not volunteer labor. We mentioned that before, and in the spirit of keeping Canadians engaged and providing candidates with the resources that they need to really win elections. Having a volunteer or volunteers do work for you, that would not be considered, obviously, as you know, volunteer labor. So therefore, it does not fall under the category of what we call like non-monetary contribution. So it has no commercial value to it. But what would be considered something of a commercial value would be that would actually fall under the category of monetary, non-monetary contribution would be the use of property or money provided to a political party, entity, or candidate without a charge, or at less than commercial value. So meaning that if you were to have bought that cell phone, for example, from someone, as opposed to have it given to you, if I decided that I wanted to give this to Nathan, but it would typically cost $500, and I give it to him at a discounted price of $250, well, then that would actually go against Election Canada, compliance rules, because anything that's being handed to the campaign cannot be received or given at less than its commercial value. So the commercial value in relation to property or service, by definition from Election Canada, is the lowest amount charged. It's the lowest amount charged at the time that it was provided for the same kind of quantity of property or service, or for the same use of property or money by either someone who provided the property or service, as I mentioned earlier, or another person who provides that property or service on a commercial basis in the particular area. And that typically applies to campaign offices. So if your neighbor, whom you're very good friends with, tells you, oh, hey, listen, Nathan, I have this, property. I know you're looking for a campaign office. I typically put it up on the market for $3,000 a month. I'll give it to you at half the cost. You're not allowed to take it. And if you're going to be taking it, you can take it, but you're still going to need to really add on the difference of the amount of money that this friend of yours or this neighbor would have actually put it on in the market for. So you're not allowed to do that. So these are some of the notions that are really important for you to understand. Like navigating the field of compliance is never an easy thing to do, and you do require to make sure that you're up to date on Election Canada rules as it relates to compliance, because the rules in financing actually do change. So every now and then, make sure that as you consider running for office, or if you're already there, that you are doing your due diligence in updating yourself, and make sure you do have an official agent who's also very diligent about these things, because at the end of the day, you want to run for office, but you also want to make sure that you are respecting the rules, because that can also become a potential issue in your campaign. And then when you're running a campaign, the last thing you want is to actually be distracted. So you just don't want to be in that position.
Cool. Thank you so much, Alan, for sharing with us all of this. Just a few questions for you to wrap things up. So the first is, before politics, what did your career and upbringing look like?
Why don't we start with my upbringing? I grew up in an environment where social, political issues were part of the menu on the table every time we were having dinner. And I think, you know, growing up, as a black man, my parents, they knew something, that they knew that the personal is political. And what that means is that every single aspect of our lives was influenced in some way by politics, from what food was going to our lunch boxes, to how much tax credit my parents were getting because they weren't making that much money. Every single aspect of politics really affected their lives. And to be in such an environment where you're fully aware of the impact of policy in your life, you actually have the obligation, if you're not getting involved in politics, but at the very least, if you're getting involved civically. And this is why at a very young age, I started volunteering, because I really want to make a difference. And I volunteer from anything, ranging from helping out, older, people who can actually get the groceries because they actually had mobility issues, to helping new immigrants or refugees who are looking to settle here in Canada, and help them find furniture to move into their new place and start a comfortable life in Canada, or at least a more decent life in Canada in many cases. So I really ran the entire gamut of really civic engagement. But on a professional level, I went to school to study political science. I graduated with a master's in international relations and conflict studies. But I really went into teaching a little bit. So I was teaching French and English as second languages before finally deciding to really make a little bit of a jump, in political engagement.
That's awesome. And so at that point, what drove you to get involved with politics and community advocacy?
I think, just the reality is that, growing up in that environment where you're fully aware of the impact of government decisions on your life. I think we felt, at least in our family, that we had two obligations. One is just to make sure that we're doing our best to make, because we just don't want to take our system for granted. Because if we were to take it for granted, we would probably be, the first ones, to pay the price for it. But there was also this notion that, listen, it is part of your duty, as a citizen, to be involved in whatever form that engagement takes. It's critical that you be involved. And then for me, I think politics really represented to me the one area where I feel it is possible to have impact on a grand scale. And the way I looked at it was, I can decide to sit on the sidelines and complain about what our governments are doing, or I can decide to roll up my sleeves and get involved. And then I was never under the illusion that my sole involvement was sufficient to really change anything. But I did believe that with every single person thinking the same thing and doing the same thing, we could actually harness just enough power and to mobilize, people and really get involved and really try to make a decent change in their communities, in their country.
Cool. And different experiences that you've had. What are some key lessons for candidates from previous campaigns you've worked on?
Where do you want me to start? Do you want me to start with the number 300 or with the number 10 out of these lessons, because there's tons of them. But for in the interest of brevity, I will basically outline a number of them. I think the first to me is most candidates coming into politics do not have an understanding of what it requires, what it entails to be in politics. And you don't believe it, but it's actually the most common mistake. And what I mean by that is that most candidates are really totally unprepared. And I think this is why it's critical to be having this kind of conversation we're having right now, having this kind of project in place, because I think at the very least, we are creating a platform that allows people to hear stories about, how others might have not fared very well at the beginning, but nevertheless succeeded. But it also allows people like me who basically worked in that environment, as someone who basically trained candidates and really put up campaign teams together to provide some perspectives on what those things are. So I would say, like, number one is the idea of candidates being fully prepared coming to elections. The second thing is candidates overestimating their actual weight in a particular riding, in a particular demographic. Our system works in a way where oftentimes your electoral success or failure, for that matter, vastly depends on the performance of your leader. And I think, in a way that, we don't often talk about, political candidates really take it upon themselves to be doing a little bit too much, thinking that, listen, I need to learn everything about policy. I need to, every nook and corner, of the electoral process. When in fact, what they should be doing is really putting the focus on those areas that they can actually control. So most candidates can only affect just anywhere between, I say, 3 to 7% of the vote in their particular riding. And that means advertising, being out in the community, participating at events, mobilizing volunteers, and doing all the things they need to do to give themselves the chance to actually win an election. And what that means is that candidates are oftentimes not very attuned to that reality. And by trying to spread themselves thin, they're really missing the opportunity to really focus on those areas where they can now really put their strength to use and have an impact on the outcome of their election. And I would say the third one, if allow me to go for three, generally speaking, is that candidates really underestimate the value of door knocking and in-person contact. So we're basically moving increasingly in a world where people do everything from the comfort of their home or the comfort of their cell phones. And what we're not seeing is, more people getting out there and feeling the need to really be in contact with their, with voters, with their, future constituents. And I think there's a critical element to it. Phone calls are good. You will speak to people, but there's such a different feel and experience to shaking someone's hand and looking straight into their eyes and talking to them and asking them for the vote that you just cannot replicate with a cell phone. And I think candidates oftentimes tend to underestimate the importance of door knocking, but door knocking really in the context of mobilizing and campaigning is probably the most potent tool that the candidate actually has.
Thanks, Allen. Just listening to some of the things you were talking about, your past experiences. What would you say is the biggest deterrent that underrepresented demographics face when they're running for office, when even they're thinking about running for office? And from your own encounters, what would you say to someone who perhaps feels those sentiments?
So I would say the biggest deterrent really for candidates, especially people of color running for office, is really the question of resources. Those resources, take on many forms. They're financial, they're social, and then there are a number of things. And I think at the financial level, people seem to underestimate how much money it takes and how much of a commitment it takes to actually run for office. And then oftentimes, in a way that really reflects the reality of being BIPOC, oftentimes being Black, you don't always oftentimes, have the luxury of quitting your job and decide to run for office. And then this is something that is very systemic in nature, because the nature of the job is such that oftentimes you're required to make certain sacrifices beforehand. So if you'd been working for some time, you want to run for office, you want to go into winning a nomination. Oftentimes it means quitting your job 8 months, 9 months, a year ahead of time, and spending time on the ground, meeting people. And then most people oftentimes, because they don't necessarily have the financial means to do that, find themselves in a position where, yes, they decide to run, but they're not really putting themselves in a position where where they actually have the best chance to win. And I think that to me is really a major deterrent for a lot of people running for office. And then oftentimes too, is the idea that a lot of people think, if I'm Black or if I'm of color and I'm running for office, I cannot win in a riding that is not, represented, where there is not like a large representation of people that look like me. This is also a myth because the notion of running for office in our system and your chances of really winning an election or a nomination is contingent on whether or not that particular riding is predisposed to vote a certain way. So don't think for a minute that if you are in a riding where it's predominantly white, for example, that because you have color you're not going to win. I think that's a notion that people don't understand. So do not try to crowd yourselves all into the few ridings where there's high big pockets of ethnic populations. Trying to spread yourself thin as well. You might be able to go in something that is just outside the GTA completely. And then find a riding there where not a lot of people are really contesting for it. But because the riding is a riding that is predisposed to vote in a certain way, well, then throwing yourself into that nomination race, that you will win. And then if you can win there, well, when it comes to election, your fortunes will not be determined by the color of your skin. They'll be determined by the very DNA of the riding that you're running in.
No, that's incredibly insightful. Really, just building on that, what piece of advice would you have for someone that doesn't think they have the political capital or experience necessary to get elected or to even run? Really, how do you push someone to get the momentum started, as you said? Right, it really is that first step that is the hardest. And what piece of advice do you have for just getting started?
I would say to get started, I would say start having conversations with people that have really gone through an election before. If you're unsure about this, the first step should be to go out there, find people that are running for office. It could be a local member of parliament. You can tell them, listen, I've been passionate about politics. I'm passionate about making a change. I want to get involved. But I find the prospect of running for office is very daunting. And I'd like to know if you have any piece of advice you'd like to impart on me. I think most candidates or past elected members of parliament or current members of parliament would be more than willing to find the time to really share with you their own experiences. And I think we all have different backgrounds, different experiences, but being able to get out there and really have that information firsthand for someone who can tell you about their own success, but also their own failures and how they might have over the years decided to march on and really stay committed to winning. I think that's a very good first step to do. The second thing to think about is whether or not this is something you have the guts to do. I think running for office is not for the faint of the heart. You do need to think about whether or not this is something I feel I have the passion for it, because it can be very, very, very grueling. So having to do 17, 18-hour days and having to do that for days on end, especially if you start with a nomination that spills into a campaign, you can easily go anywhere between 18 months to 2 years, running for something. And if you do not have the passion for it, the discipline, and I would say there's the sheer grit to really push through every day, even when the odds seem very impossible, well, then you may have to reconsider running for office, because this is something that does require a lot of determination, a commitment, and a level of grit in order to achieve.
Thank you so much, Allen, for your insights, not only on election compliance and financing, but also your lived experiences and the insights you've provided on that, and how you grew up, your professional experience, your political experience, and some lessons learned or lessons earned in terms of other people seeking a nomination. Do you have any closing remarks on this topic, or just general remarks for anybody seeking a nomination?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think it was great being able to share a little bit of the knowledge that I have, the experience that I've lived with anyone who will find that helpful and useful. And I think the one thing I would say is, you know, our country needs more people that look like us to be running for office, not because out of a sense of, that being the right thing to do, that just because we require that representation, because our different voices actually do make a difference, at the table. So if you think you want to run for office, I say congratulations. Be ready to do the work. Make the commitment. Do know that you can win. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to fundamentals. Are you determined? Do you have the team that requires? Do you have the funds that it takes? And are you ready to get out there and knock on doors? If you feel that you check off all these marks, I think you're well on your way, and I wish you the best of luck.
The next module is Module 8, Nomination Day and Getting the Votes You Need. Follow us for future module releases.